Frank "Black Caesar" Matthews. In the summer of 1973, a man who controlled the heroin trade across 21 states walked out of a Brooklyn courthouse, stepped into a waiting car, and vanished. He took with him an estimated $15 to $20 million in cash and a girlfriend named Cheryl Denise Brown. More than 50 years later, no one knows whether he is alive, dead, or living quietly somewhere under a name no one has ever managed to trace. He was born in Durham, North Carolina, in 1944, and raised by an aunt after his mother passed when he was only 4 years old. As a boy, he ran with a gang that stole chickens, and by his 20s, he had drifted north to Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, looking for something bigger. What set him apart from the men around him came down to a single decision. When the established mafia families refused to supply him, he simply went around them. Through a Harlem numbers boss, Matthews reached a Cuban supplier with direct pipelines running out of Venezuela and connections to the French networks moving heroin into the country. He no longer needed the Italians, and that independence turned him into one of the most powerful traffickers the country had ever seen. The DEA would later rank him among the top 10 drug traffickers in American history, estimating that in 1972 alone, he cleared around $10 million. In today's money, that single year brought in close to $80 million. He ran 2 fortified drug mills in Brooklyn that the crew nicknamed the Ponderosa and the OK Corral, their walls reinforced with steel and concrete and guarded with automatic weapons. According to the DEA, Matthews controlled the cutting, packaging, and sale of heroin in every major city along the East Coast, with an operation reaching into 21 states. He bought a home in the Tot Hill section of Staten Island, an enclave favored by mafia figures, only a short drive from the residence of a sitting Gambino boss. He was also organizing. In 1971, he hosted a summit of Black and Hispanic dealers in Atlanta, and the following year a second gathering in Las Vegas, staged around a Muhammad Ali fight, both built on one idea: importing heroin without ever asking the mafia for permission. Federal agents watched the guest lists closely, and for the men in that room, Matthews was proof it could be done. In December of 1972, Matthews was indicted in Brooklyn over an attempt to move roughly 40 pounds of cocaine through Miami. He was arrested the following month at the airport in Las Vegas on tax and conspiracy charges. His bail was first set at $5 million, a record for its time, before being reduced to $325,000. So what does a man worth tens of millions do when the walls finally start closing in? He ran. On July 2, 1973, Matthews failed to appear in Brooklyn federal court. He left with Cheryl Denise Brown and an estimated $15 to $20 million in cash, and no verified sighting of him has been confirmed in the more than 50 years since. The federal prosecutor assigned to his case called him a pioneering giant of drug distribution, a man who had built something no one had built before him. For an operation that size to simply evaporate, with its leader and its money gone in a single afternoon, was almost without precedent. Investigators chased leads for decades, and the theories only multiplied. Some believed a rival family had taken his life to keep him silent. Others were certain he had slipped abroad with his fortune. One author who spent years on the case put it plainly, saying that anyone who claims to know what became of Matthews is either fooling themselves or lying, and that if forced to bet, he would guess Matthews was long dead, because no one disappears that completely and lives. As of the most recent records, Frank Matthews has never been found. His case remains one of the largest open fugitive files in the history of the DEA, and if he were alive today, he would be in his 80s. Matthews built his empire by refusing to answer to anyone, and in the end, he answered to no court at all. A generation later, in the same city, another man would face the law completely and still prove that 4 prison walls could not contain his reach. Peter "Pistol Pete" Rawlik. By the time he was 24 years old, Peter Rawlik had built one of the most feared street organizations in the Bronx and made himself a millionaire. The drugs and the money were not what set him apart. What set him apart was that even after the law finally caught up with him, he kept giving orders, and people kept dying because of them. Rawlik grew up in the Soundview houses in the South Bronx, the son of a man who had once been convicted alongside one of Harlem's most notorious heroin figures, and who would himself go on to serve a 50-year federal sentence. That inheritance seemed to shape him early. He founded a set of the Bloods known as Sex, Money, Murder, and by his late teens, he was moving cocaine and crack from the Bronx down through the Carolinas and into Pittsburgh, using vehicles fitted with hidden compartments. His soldiers stretched across several states. The set he created, Sex, Money, Murder, would outlast him and spread far beyond New York, becoming one of the most infamous blood factions in the entire country. By any measure the street cared about, he was a young man with everything, and he had gotten there younger than almost anyone. He was also personally responsible for a string of deaths. In 1994, he took the life of Carlton Hines, a talented young basketball player whose promise on the court had once seemed like a way out of the neighborhood. He was tied as well to the death of a witness named Carlos Mestre and to others who might have spoken against him. By the time he was 24, prosecutors would say, he had personally taken multiple lives and ordered still more. In late 1995, Rawlik was arrested near Grant's Tomb in Harlem, connected to the Hines case, and found carrying a firearm. His own mother later recounted how she bailed him out after he served the mandatory time on that gun charge. It was a decision that would haunt everyone involved. You would think someone might have seen where it was heading. No one stopped it. Out on bail and later facing federal charges, Rawlik did not slow down. From a jail cell in North Carolina in 1997, he ordered what became known as a Thanksgiving Day tragedy back home in the Bronx: the deaths of 2 of his own associates. One of them had been preparing to cooperate with the government, and that was reason enough. The order traveled from a cell hundreds of miles away and was carried out on a holiday, a demonstration that distance and steel bars had changed nothing about how the organization worked. How do you hold a man accountable for deaths he arranged from behind bars, through phone calls and messages, never once in the room himself? The government found a way. In January of 1998, Rawlik was convicted in federal court in North Carolina on a cocaine conspiracy and a firearms count, drawing 40 years plus another 5. Then, facing a possible federal death sentence in New York, he pleaded guilty in the year 2000 to a life sentence without the possibility of parole, plus another 105 years. As part of that agreement, he accepted indefinite isolation and strict limits on his contact with the outside world. Standing before the court, he admitted plainly that he and his crew had possessed firearms and taken lives, and that they had done it to protect one another. The United States Attorney told the public he had pleaded guilty to taking or ordering the deaths of 6 people. The plea spared him the death penalty, but it came with conditions rarely attached to any sentence: a recognition by everyone in that courtroom that Rawlik had already proven he could reach out and hurt people no matter where he was being held. As of the latest available records, Peter Rawlach is held in the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, in long-term isolation, with no record of release. He was in his mid-20s when those doors closed behind him. He has been behind them ever since. Rawlach came up inside a violent world that already existed in New York. The man in the next case helped bring one of the things that made that world so deadly in the first place, a drug that rewired whole neighborhoods and a willingness to protect it that unsettled even hardened investigators. Delroy Uzi Edwards. In the middle of the 1980s, a young man from Kingston, Jamaica arrived in Brooklyn on a tourist visa. Within a few years, he was running one of the first crack operations in the city, taking in as much as $100,000 a day. And when the federal government finally put him on trial, the jury was so frightened of him that they asked the judge for protection. Delroy Edwards had earned his nickname, Uzi, as a political enforcer during one of Jamaica's most violent election seasons, named for the weapon he favored. He carried that reputation with him into Brooklyn and built an organization, sometimes called the Rankers, that was among the very first to sell crack in Bedford-Stuyvesant. From there, he pushed into Washington, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Reporting from the time described a group of around 50 members running a $100,000 a day operation at its peak, supplied out of Miami and Los Angeles. Crack was new to the streets then, cheap and devastating, and Edwards was one of the men who understood before almost anyone else how much money there was in it. The violence attached to that operation is what defined the case. His second-in-command would later testify to a prolonged torture in a Brooklyn basement that ended a rival's life, an account so disturbing it stayed with the jurors long after the trial was over. Edwards was also said to have taken the life of a young member of his own crew he suspected of stealing from him. By the government's count, the deaths and the injuries stacked up into the dozens, and many of the people caught in that violence had nothing to do with the drug trade at all. They were simply nearby when it happened. For a man who had entered the country on nothing more than a tourist visa, the speed of that rise was staggering, and so was the human cost attached to it. For federal prosecutors, treating a crack posse the way they had once treated the mafia was still a new idea in the late 1980s. Agents spent months documenting the structure of the organization, who answered to whom, who carried out the orders, and how the money moved. The goal was not just to convict Edwards of a single act, but to prove that the entire enterprise existed to commit crime, and that he sat at the top of it. How many lives does one operation have to touch before the full weight of the federal government comes down on it? For Edwards, the answer arrived in 1988. He was arrested in March of that year, and by July of 1989, a Brooklyn federal jury convicted him on all 42 counts against him. Those counts included 10 homicides, 13 assaults that injured 18 people, several of them innocent bystanders, a kidnapping, and the racketeering and continuing enterprise charges that tied everything together. Prosecutors told the court he had made mountains of money as one of the first crack dealers in the city. The verdict frightened the jurors so badly that they asked the judge, Raymond Deary, for protection, and he ordered federal marshals to escort them and to keep their names shielded. That fear said something the charges could not fully capture. These were people who had sat through weeks of testimony, listened to the full record of what the organization had done, and come away believing that a guilty verdict might not be enough to keep them safe. The sentence matched the scale of the case. On December 1st, 1989, according to reporting from the time, Edwards received 7 life terms plus another 599 years in what was described as the federal government's first racketeering takedown of a Jamaican posse leader. In plain terms, he was never walking out of a prison again. The case also served as a template. The same racketeering laws that had been built to break the Italian mafia were now being turned on a new generation of organizations, and prosecutors across the country were paying attention. As of the latest available records, Delroy Edwards remains incarcerated, reported to be held in the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. Edwards turned a Brooklyn basement into a place people did not walk out of. Across the river, in the Bronx, another operation was doing something disturbingly similar, run by a man who wrapped all of it in the language of the church, Clarence "Preacher" Heatley. In the Harlem and the Bronx of the 1990s, there was a crew whose enforcers were called janitors, because their job was to clean up after the harm was done. The man who led them went by the Preacher. By the time investigators had finished their work, his name would be connected to dozens of deaths. Clarence Heatley led an operation known at times as the Preacher Crew, and at times simply as the Family, working out of an apartment on 142nd Street and a building on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. He carried another nickname too, one the streets gave him, the Black Hand of Death. His crew sold cocaine, crack, heroin, and more, but a great deal of the money came from extorting other dealers, sometimes $10,000 at a time. His top lieutenant was a former housing police officer. His enforcers, the ones he called janitors, some of them marked with a tattoo of a bucket and a mop, dealt with anyone the crew decided had become a problem. The scale of the violence was staggering. Investigators would ultimately link the crew to nearly 45 deaths across the two boroughs. Much of it grew out of the extortion business. When another dealer refused to pay, or was even suspected of holding back, the janitors were sent to settle it, and the settlement was rarely something anyone recovered from. The basement on the Grand Concourse became the place where those problems were resolved, and the reputation of what happened there did as much work as the violence itself. People paid because they understood what the alternative was. By the government's account, the crew operated this way for the better part of a decade before the case against it finally came together. Among the most disturbing allegations was Heatley's connection to the abduction of a child, a young boy related to a well-known Harlem figure, a case that seasoned investigators described as among the most difficult they had ever worked. The child did not survive. It was the kind of case that changes the people who work it, and it hardened the resolve of the investigators trying to bring the crew down. When a man is tied to that many deaths, what does the justice system even do with him? A joint task force of city detectives and federal agents, working the case for years under a unit known as the C-11 Squad, slowly assembled the evidence needed to bring it into a courtroom. Piecing together a crew tied to that many deaths meant persuading frightened witnesses to talk about a group whose entire reputation was built on what happened to people who talked. Heatley was arrested in August of 1996. In February of 1999, he pleaded guilty to racketeering and 13 homicides, a plea made specifically to avoid becoming the first federal death penalty trial held in Manhattan since the 1950s. His lieutenant, the former housing officer, pleaded guilty weeks later to 11. Heatley offered the government information in the hope of a better outcome, but prosecutors declined a full cooperation deal. They noted for the record that he had provided little of real value, mostly details about the people beneath him and his own crew, rather than anyone who might have supplied or protected the organization from above. In effect, he had tried to trade away his own soldiers while keeping the larger picture to himself, and the government was not interested in that bargain. On June 4, 1999, Judge Michael Mukasey sentenced Heatley to life in prison plus another 225 years. His attorney later explained the reasoning behind the plea simply, saying there was no upside to a trial if it meant risking execution, and that his client wanted to spare his family from ever having to live through that. For a man tied to dozens of deaths, a guilty plea that guaranteed he would die in prison was, in the strange arithmetic of the case, the outcome his own lawyers were fighting to secure. As of the latest available records, Clarence Heatley is alive and serving his sentence at a federal facility in Alabama. Heatley was brought down by a law originally written to dismantle the mafia, the same racketeering statute that ended so many of these empires. That law was also waiting for a man who spent nearly 20 years hiding an entire drug operation behind something as ordinary as a flower shop. Manuel Giovanni Rodriguez Perez. For nearly 2 decades, he controlled the wholesale marijuana market in New York City, moving it by the ton, hidden inside shipments of flowers. But the drugs were never really what the case was about. What a federal judge would eventually call catastrophic and immeasurable was the trail of bodies he left behind, protecting his corner of the business. Manuel Giovanni Rodriguez Perez went by several names on the street, among them a shortened first name and one that translated roughly to the monster. From the early 1990s until 2010, his organization dominated the city's wholesale marijuana trade, bringing product up from Florida and California by the ton, disguised inside flower shipments and boxes marked with a single small letter, so his people knew which ones mattered. The operation generated an estimated $25 million, the figure he would later be ordered to forfeit. For years, the business looked, on paper, like any other wholesale operation moving flowers and produce through the city, which was precisely the point. The legitimate front was not something he wore occasionally. It was the machine that quietly moved everything else. Marijuana is often thought of as the least violent corner of the drug world. This case was the exception that proved how wrong that assumption can be. The federal case that eventually took shape accused him of a level of violence that went far beyond the drug trade itself. According to the government, Rodriguez Perez once watched the death of a rival named Francisco Perez in the autumn of 1997 from the safety of a nearby pool hall, and later told a witness that he had claimed that death as a birthday present to himself. And somehow, it gets worse. In another instance, he took a man's life in a Bronx park and buried him in a grave that had been dug in advance. In yet another, men he hired left an innocent bystander permanently paralyzed. He even arranged a death from behind bars. The violence spanned New York, New Jersey, and the Dominican Republic, and it followed a simple logic. Anyone who threatened the business, or him, did not last long. How do you finally corner a man who has spent almost 20 years taking lives to protect a business hidden in plain sight? The answer was a sweeping multi-agency operation, led by federal Homeland Security investigators and known as Operation Green Venom, that dismantled the organization in 2010 and arrested more than 50 of its members. Reporting later noted that the case swept up associates from well beyond the drug world, including figures connected to the music and publishing industries. Rodriguez Perez himself was taken into custody in October of that year, and the indictment that followed ran to 48 counts, including 10 homicides and 10 attempted homicides. In June of 2016, he pleaded guilty before Judge Laura Taylor Swain to racketeering conspiracy, admitting to 9 deaths and 10 attempts on other lives. He was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to forfeit $25 million. The prosecutor who brought the case described him as a cold-blooded man responsible for the executions of 9 people, someone who had ruled his enterprise with an iron fist and ruthlessly protected his territory. The judge, in handing down the sentence, spoke of the breadth and violence of his conduct and of what she called his immense willingness and capacity to exact vengeance. The damage his crimes had done to the people around them, she said, was catastrophic and immeasurable. It was a rare moment where the language of the courtroom seemed to match the reality of the case, because for the families of the 9 people he admitted taking from the world, the arithmetic of a life sentence would never balance out. For a decade he had operated in plain sight, a produce and flower business masking one of the most violent drug organizations the city had seen in years, and it took a coordinated effort across multiple agencies and several states to finally bring it down. As of the latest available records, Manuel Giovanni Rodriguez Perez is serving a life sentence with no possibility of release. Every man to this point shared some version of the same ending, a cell they would never leave, or a disappearance no one could explain. But not everyone who ran these streets stayed on them until the end. A few managed to walk away while they still could, and lived to tell people exactly what the life had taken from them. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Azy Faison. For a few years in the 1980s, Azy Faison was one of the most successful cocaine dealers in Harlem, moving enough product to pull in tens of thousands of dollars in a single week. Then one night, in an apartment that was supposed to be safe, everything he had built nearly cost him his life. What he did in the years that followed is the part almost no one expects. Faison was born in the Bronx in 1964, and his family moved to the Sugar Hill section of Harlem after a fire pushed them out of their home. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and worked at a dry cleaner's, and then, by his own account, he watched the film Scarface and decided he wanted the life it was selling. He found a Dominican supplier and started moving cocaine. Within a few years, he had become the main breadwinner in his household, earning more in a week than most people around him earned in a year. He came up alongside names that Harlem still remembers, dealers like Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez, in an era when the cocaine and crack trade was reshaping the neighborhood block by block. By his own accounts, he was wholesaling cocaine and taking in somewhere between $40,000 and $100,000 a week. He has always been careful to frame those figures as his own memory rather than a court's finding, and there is a reason for that. Unlike almost everyone else in this story, Faison was never convicted of running a drug empire. The money was real. The paper trail never was. On the night of August 21st, 1987, a robbery at his aunt's apartment on the Grand Concourse turned into something far worse. When it was over, 3 people had lost their lives, and 3 more were wounded. Faison himself was shot 9 times, and somehow he survived. He would carry the physical and emotional weight of that night for the rest of his life, and it became the moment everything began to change for him. By the end of that decade, the world he had come up in was collapsing around him. Rich Porter, one of the most admired figures of that Harlem era, was gone. Alpo Martinez, once a close associate, had become an informant. The glamour that had pulled a teenage Faison into the life had curdled into something he no longer recognized, and the young man who had once wanted to live like a character in a movie now found himself surrounded by funerals. The robbery that nearly ended his own life was never resolved the way such cases are supposed to be. Faison lived. 3 people did not. And he came out of it with a choice to make about whether to answer that violence with more of his own. By then, he had seen enough of the life to know exactly where it ended. So what does a man do after he has been shot 9 times and watched the life he chose take everything around him? For Faison, the answer was to walk away from it entirely. He wound down his operation, and after the death of his friend Rich Porter around 1990, he left the business for good. He turned to music instead, forming an anti-drug rap group called Mob Style and releasing a solo record called Streetwise in 1991. And he began speaking openly about what the life had actually cost him. He described the group's music as a warning rather than entertainment, and he attached his own name and face to that message at a time when almost no one from that world was willing to. Years later, his story became the basis for the 2002 film Paid in Full, though Faison himself has criticized that movie for making the life look glamorous, which he insists it never truly was. He went on to co-author a memoir and a documentary, both carrying the same blunt title, Game Over. As of the latest available records, Azy Faison is alive. He works today as an author, a speaker, and an anti-drug advocate, telling young people the version of the story that the movies always left out. Faison used music as a way out of the drug world. The next man used the music industry itself as a mask for a drug operation that ran quietly beneath one of the most successful management careers in all of hip-hop. James "Jimmy" Henchman Rosemond. To the music industry, James Rosemond was a powerful manager, the man behind hit records and the careers of major artists. What almost no one saw was the second business running underneath the first, a cocaine pipeline that stretched across the entire country, and a single act of retaliation that would eventually seal his fate. Rosemond was born in Harlem in 1965 and raised in Brooklyn, the son of Haitian immigrants. He built a genuinely influential career in music. He founded an industry conference called How Can I Be Down, and later ran a management company, Czar Entertainment, that represented some of the biggest names in rap and R&B, artists like The Game, Akon, Gucci Mane, and Brandy. He had even had a hand in the Salt and Peppa hit Shoop years earlier. On paper, he was a success story, a man who had pulled himself into the center of the business through talent and relentless work, and who moved comfortably among the most powerful people in it. Behind that front, prosecutors would prove, Rosemond ran a bicoastal cocaine operation, shipping 50 to 100 kilograms a month from Los Angeles to New York. For years, it ran in parallel with the legitimate company, the same offices, the same travel, the same network of contacts, serving two very different businesses. The product was hidden inside music equipment cases and packages coated in mustard to throw off drug-sniffing dogs, and the cash was shipped back west the very same way. Between 2008 and 2010, agents seized more than $2.8 million in proceeds, including $785,000 found inside a single equipment case at a Manhattan recording studio. That is not a typo. Nearly $800,000 in one case, in one room. There was also a death. In 2009, Rosemond arranged for a man named Lowell Fletcher, an associate of a rival music camp, to be fatally shot in retaliation for an earlier assault on Rosemond's young son. He paid for it with a kilogram of cocaine. It was the kind of decision that would take years to fully catch up with him, but it eventually did. For most of that time, it was a double life very few people around him ever suspected. How do you separate the manager from the trafficker when the same man built both side by side for years? The government did not try to. Rosemond fled, was captured after a 2-month manhunt in the summer of 2011, and in June of 2012, a federal jury in Brooklyn convicted him on all 13 counts tied to the drug operation. Beyond the prison term, he was ordered to give up millions of dollars in cash and property built on the proceeds. The judge, John Gleason, sentenced him to a mandatory life term, telling him plainly that not every kingpin deserved that punishment, but that he certainly did. and describing the operation as astounding in its breadth, duration, and intensity. The United States Attorney at the time, Loretta Lynch, called him a thug in a suit who had flooded the same streets his own artists had come from with cocaine. The case involving Fletcher's death took far longer to resolve. It moved through a hung jury, then a conviction that was later overturned on appeal, and finally, a retrial. In November of 2017, Rosemond was convicted once more, and the following year a judge sentenced him to life plus another 30 years. By the time it was over, the United States Attorney overseeing the case said that Rosemond's fate had been sealed and that he would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. Through all of it, Rosemond has continued to insist that he never ordered anyone's death. He was also long accused, though never charged, of involvement in the 1994 shooting of the rapper Tupac Shakur at a Manhattan recording studio, an accusation he has always denied, and one for which the window to bring charges eventually closed. As of the latest available records, James Rosemond is serving multiple life sentences in federal prison. Rosemond spent his freedom trying to keep two worlds from ever touching, and in the end, he lost both of them. The next man came out of that same Harlem cocaine era, served his time, and did something almost none of the others managed to do. He built a lasting life on the other side of it. Kevin Chiles. In the crack era of the 1980s, Kevin Chiles ran one of the largest cocaine operations in Harlem, at one point described as the biggest the neighborhood had seen since the days of Nicky Barnes. Two separate juries could not agree on whether to convict him, and what he did after prison turned his name into something no one back then would ever have predicted. Chiles was born in 1966 and raised in Harlem, in the Polo Grounds Towers, directly across from the legendary courts of Rucker Park. He rose during the mid-1980s alongside the same generation as Rich Porter, Alpo, and Azy Faison. He built a large cocaine operation and layered legitimate-looking businesses on top of it, sneaker stores and a clothing outlet that carried his own branding, and a small record label that would go on to sign the producer Ron Browse. One detail captured how fast that money moved. By his own account, you could take delivery of a package in the morning and be holding several $1,000s by that same evening. The life took from him personally, the way it took from almost everyone in it. In 1989, his mother, Barbara, lost her life to the violence that surrounded the trade. It was a loss he would later write about at length and point to as one of the moments that made him question everything he was doing. That generation of Harlem dealers has become almost mythic in hindsight, but the reality underneath the myth was brutal arithmetic. Of the young men who ran those blocks in the mid-1980s, most ended up dead or imprisoned for life. What separates Chiles from nearly every other name here is simply that he lived to tell it, and then chose to. After a federal investigation that stretched over 2 years, Chiles was charged in the mid-1990s with running a continuing criminal enterprise, along with money laundering and narcotics counts covering roughly 1987 through 1994. The continuing criminal enterprise charge is one of the most serious in the federal drug code, reserved for those the government believes sit at the very top of an organization, and a conviction on it can carry a mandatory life term. Chiles went to trial, and the case ended in a hung jury. The government tried again, and again the jury could not reach a verdict. And no, that is not a mistake. 2 full trials, 2 juries, and not a single conviction between them. So what do you do when the government has spent years building a case against you, and 12 people twice over cannot agree that it holds together? facing the real possibility of a life sentence if a third trial went the other way. Chiles chose certainty over the gamble and pleaded guilty in exchange for a 10-year federal sentence. He served it. And while he was still incarcerated, in 1999, he and his wife Tiffany started a magazine about street life and the culture around it. A publication that would come to be called the original Street Bible and would shape how a whole generation understood that world. After his release, he built it into a real and lasting business, and years later, he published a memoir that laid out his rise, his fall, and what he described as his redemption. For a man the government had tried twice to put away for life, an ordinary desk and a printing schedule were an unlikely place to end up. What began as a project to pass the time in a prison cell became something with real cultural weight. The magazine documented the lives and cases of exactly the kind of figures this story is built around, told from the inside. And for years, it was one of the only places that history was being written down at all. Chiles had spent his youth building an empire the law eventually dismantled. In his second act, he built an archive of that entire world instead. As of the latest available records, Kevin Chiles is alive, working as an author, a publisher, and an entrepreneur. He is one of the very few men in this story to walk out the other side and stay out. Chiles turned his story into a business the law could never touch. The next man also tried to turn his life on the streets into a public identity, this time as a rapper. But the words he chose to put on record ended up doing the prosecution's work for them. Ronald "Raw Diggs" Herron. Ronald Herron wanted to be known as a rapper. He built a real following, released videos that drew more than 1 million views apiece, and rapped openly about the life he was living in Brooklyn. Those same videos would one day be played in a federal courtroom, not as music, but as evidence. Herron was born in 1982 and grew up in the Gowanus houses in Brooklyn. He led a set of the Bloods known as the Murderous Mad Dogs, controlling the drug trade in and around the Gowanus houses and a nearby development. Under the name Raw Diggs, he pursued a rap career in earnest, collaborating with established artists like Uncle Murda and Waka Flocka Flame, and one of his videos, a track titled Eulogy, drew well over 1 million views. He cultivated an image as a man who had truly lived everything he rapped about. The problem for him was that he had. Herron was tied to 3 deaths across the 2000s. There was a man named Frederick Brooks, whose life was taken back in 2001, and for which Herron had actually been acquitted in state court after witnesses grew too frightened to testify against him. Years later came the deaths of Richard Russo in 2008 and Victor Zapata in 2009. That acquittal is part of what makes the case so striking. The state had already tried and failed to hold him accountable once, and it was only when the federal government folded everything together, the drugs, the racketeering, and his own words, that the full picture finally held. Witnesses in that earlier state case had good reason to be afraid, and their silence had once been enough to set him free. The federal government made sure that would not happen a second time. In his songs and his videos, Herron boasted about leading his set and about having taken a life, sometimes in language that was hard to read as anything but a confession. So when federal prosecutors finally built their case, they turned his own recordings against him, presenting the lyrics as near literal accounts of things he had actually done. What happens when a man spends years telling the world exactly who he is, and the audience he is confessing to eventually includes a federal jury? Herron was arrested in October of 2010, and a search turned up a loaded firearm and body armor, the everyday equipment of a man who expected violence to find him. He was indicted on 21 counts, including 3 homicides, racketeering, robbery, and a range of drug and firearms charges. In June of 2014, after a month-long trial, a jury convicted him on every single count. In April of 2015, Judge Nicholas Garofis sentenced him to 12 life terms, plus another 105 years. A sentence so large it stopped being a number and became a statement. One of the prosecutors said that Herron had styled himself a rap artist, but that the jury's verdict made clear who he really was: a dealer and a man who had sought power through fear and intimidation. Herron pushed back at his sentencing, telling the court that the picture painted of him as some kind of devil simply was not the truth. His lawyers later challenged the use of his rap videos on free speech grounds, arguing that art should not be treated as testimony, but a federal appeals court upheld it in 2019, ruling that the recordings were plainly relevant to the case against him. As of the latest available records, Ronald Herron is serving his sentence in the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. The ruling in his case drew attention well beyond Brooklyn because it touched a question courts across the country were only beginning to wrestle with: about the point at which an artist's work stops being expression and becomes evidence. For Herron, that line had already been crossed long before the trial began. He had not simply described the life. He had named himself its author over and over, on camera and on record, for anyone who cared to listen. Herron's fame was something he manufactured himself, on record, in real time. The last man in this story had fame long before any of it, a genuine local legend whose name still meant something in Brooklyn decades later. That is exactly what made the charges against him so hard for his neighborhood to accept. James "Fly" Williams. Long before any of this, James Williams was a Brooklyn playground legend, one of the greatest streetball players the city ever produced, a college star who was drafted into the professional ranks. In his prime, people traveled across the city just to watch him play on outdoor courts, and his name was spoken in the same breath as the finest talents New York ever put on a blacktop. Decades later, at 65 years old, that name surfaced again. This time it sat at the very top of a heroin case that stunned the same neighborhood that had always loved him. Williams was born around 1953 in Brownsville, Brooklyn. As a young player, he became a star at Austin Peay, where fans packed the arenas and chanted for him to shoot. And he went on to be drafted professionally and to become a central figure in the streetball histories of New York. He was one of the players at the heart of the classic basketball book, Heaven is a Playground. Remembered as one of the purest talents the city's playgrounds ever produced. But addiction and a long series of arrests followed him through the decades that came after. He was shot in the back during a robbery attempt in the late 1980s, served time on more than one occasion, and by his 60s had become a familiar face back in Brownsville, honored by the local professional basketball team and volunteering with young people at a neighborhood recreation center. To the people around him, he was a survivor, a legend who had somehow made it home. In May of 2017, the Brooklyn District Attorney charged Williams, then 65, along with 12 other people, including his own son and his stepson, as the alleged director of a heroin ring the office called Operation Flying High. According to prosecutors, the ring moved around 2 million individual glassine packets of heroin through several Brooklyn neighborhoods, among them Brownsville, Bushwick, Flatbush, and Fort Greene, over a matter of months. Each packet was worth only a handful of dollars on the street, but together they added up to an operation that one national sports magazine covering the case because of who Williams had once been, valued at roughly $21 million. When investigators moved in, they seized 6 firearms, including a sawed-off shotgun, more than $185,000 in cash, and around 2 kilograms of heroin, along with thousands of additional packets already prepared for sale. For a neighborhood that had claimed him as one of its own, the inventory read like a betrayal. How does a man beloved enough to be honored by his own hometown team end up accused of running one of its heroin pipelines? The district attorney addressed that contradiction head-on, saying that Williams's popularity and standing in the community may have ironically helped him hide the operation, and that a beloved local legend would now be held accountable for his actions. Among those charged alongside him were his son, who shared his name, and his stepson, known in the neighborhood by a nickname. Unlike almost every other man in this story, Williams was charged in state court rather than federal court, under New York's drug kingpin statute, a law written for exactly the kind of figure prosecutors said he had become, which carried a possible sentence of 25 years to life. In June of 2018, after his co-defendants had taken their own plea deals, Williams pleaded guilty to overseeing the sale of a controlled substance, along with conspiracy and a firearm charge. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Throughout the case, he maintained that his role had been strictly advisory, and he denied ever selling inside the recreation center or to children. For the neighborhood, the hardest part was the setting. This was a man who had spent years at that recreation center as a mentor, someone parents pointed to as proof that a kid from Brownsville could become something and come back to give it away. The Kingpin statute he was charged under was written for organizers, for the people at the top who never touched the product themselves, and prosecutors argued that his standing was not separate from the operation, but part of how it survived. The legend and the alleged director, in their telling, were the same man. As of the most recent reporting, James Williams is serving his sentence in a New York state prison, with his release expected later this decade. 10 men, 1 city, and a pattern that repeats across half a century. Fortunes built fast, protected with violence, and almost always ending in a cell, a disappearance, or a lifetime spent trying to outrun what the money truly cost. A few of them walked away and found something else. Most never got the chance. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.